I can already anticipate an objection coming from the previous portion where I examined hedonism and how hollow it seems in the modern age post-sexual revolution. But I think probably a more pertinent topic for most people is how we form relationships. And this really gets to the heart of the sexual revolution. So where do we really begin with something like the sexual revolution? Strangely enough, I think we begin with my own generation's experience with the sexual revolution. I'm an older millennial, and in many ways, millennials are the first generation to truly understand what the sexual revolution meant. Because they were the first generation to be born into the sexual revolution, to be born of parents who were themselves part of the sexual revolution. They never had to contend with any kind of ideology other than that. And I can't say the experience has been altogether positive for almost anyone I've known. But I'll start with my own reservations. That is, as a young man in the early 21st century, and how I thought I could resolve the contradictions implicit in the sexual culture of modernity. There's a certain fact of life that almost every young man of a reserved character learns between the ages of 17 and 25. And that is that the sexual culture that people constantly propound, that's constantly given to you by feminists and by other people in the mainstream media, has very, very little to do with the reality of dating and searching for partners in the real world. A lot of the behaviors people, and in particular boys, are taught at an early stage of life are ultimately counterproductive when it comes to attracting the opposite sex, and there's a great deal of anger on that front. I think the blogger Blonde in the Belly of the Beast puts it the best.
Millennial beta males, which is a huge demographic, are very, very angry, and rightfully so. They are doing what their feminist mothers taught them, which is appeal to women's emotions and listen to them and comfort them, support them. But they're being rebuffed because although women will say that this is what they want, they don't. They simply don't. And worse, behaving in the way that modern women say they want you to, emotionally discussing feelings ad nauseum, will be the very behavior that turns women off to you.
And I can remember feeling this way at a certain point in my life too. And I would like to think that I eventually got over it by finding out how ridiculous the entire endeavor of meaningless sex was, but instead I found a more common explanation, a way of putting it all together, and this came in the form of one man, called Dan Savage.
Define GGG. What does sex positive mean? GGG, good, giving, and game. What we should all be for our partners and what we have a right to expect from our partners. Good, in bed. Giving means sometimes you give pleasure without an expectation of an immediate return on that. And game means up for anything within reason. People do and will, and you say this and people kind of get upset. Sex is trivial. Sex doesn't matter. How could you sacrifice a beautiful, loving relationship for something as meaningless or trivial as sex? People do it all the time. People sabotage relationships all the time. Sexual fulfillment is important.
Dan Savage is a popular sex advice columnist who works in the Seattle area, and he also has a popular podcast. But most recently, and by recently I mean 5 or 6 years ago at this point, he became famous as a gay rights advocate, in particular starting the campaign It Gets Better. But I think more importantly, Dan Savage is really known as a person who laid out in full the full consequences of the new sexual order that's come to pass. Sure enough, the feminist utopia, where emotionally supplicating males are desired by females, is a manifest lie. Sure enough, the idea of the free love 60s is never going to come to pass, but Dan Savage painted a real enough picture with only a few elements in it. The sexual culture that was only decided by consent, quality, and contract. Sure enough, no sexual relationship, marital relationship, or even family relationship was guaranteed under this plan, but it still created the boundaries for understanding how sex worked and how it would be procured in a realistic sense. If you couldn't get a date, you weren't demonstrating sufficient value for your partners. All sexual acts were up to the standard of consent, and moreover, any relationship was just what two people contracted for themselves. There's no necessary reason to talk about what society did or what society said, because every single norm was renegotiated every single time two people came together, or in Dan Savage's case, more than two people. Norms were altogether immaterial and not worth talking about. In many ways, this solves the entire question of fairness in sexual culture, because it places the emphasis completely on the individual, and for a long time, this idea of sexuality made a lot of sense to me. It really allowed me to integrate the realities of 21st century sexual culture with my notions of what was right and wrong. But there is so much missing from it, and there's so much that's unstated about it. I'm not the first person to point out that the rules that Dan Savage brings to sexuality are very common, because they're the rules of corporate America. Dan Savage hasn't really liberated sex as much as he's incorporated it and turned it into a consumer product. Nothing is really lasting beyond the contract in Dan Savage's world. This isn't a place where marriages mean more than an agreement that's to be dissolved as soon as the relationship is no longer satisfying for both parties. It's even really hard to imagine how children could work into this world. I mean, I know Dan Savage and his partner have children, and apparently they're very happily partnered, but the reality of the sexual ethic that Dan Savage is promoting would result in many, many fractious relationships would end to the detriment of most children. Moreover, anyone who's listened to Dan Savage, either now or in the past, will realize that despite being a very outspoken feminist himself, the world he describes really exists in a place where a lot of the modern developments of feminism don't seem to have happened. There never is really a reference to affirmative consent laws, and it seems to a large degree like Dan Savage ignores or explains away a lot of feminist objections to things like objectification. Moreover, I never really hear him talk about the reality of the legal ramifications of getting divorced, which can be quite stringent for a lot of people. If we take these exceptions aside and put them in a box, in many ways Dan Savage's vision of a purely consent-driven, a purely quality-driven sexual culture is quite compelling. It even dovetails nicely with the sort of anarcho-capitalist and, dare I say, highly autistic version of the universe, where all ethics come down to free choice, and any deviation from liberty is wrong. Therefore, to a person who likes a certain amount of symmetry, and is willing to ignore a certain amount of the details, this perspective can seem quite compelling. And it also sells well, because this corporate version of sexuality is also a bonanza for people who are trying to sell sex. So we're left asking ourselves, is this it? Have we solved the problem of the sexual revolution? Is there a golden age of coherency once we've accomplished destigmatizing the last few barriers to free consent, legalized prostitution, legalized polygamy, legalized pretty much anything? Would that this were so. I admit that unlike a lot of elements of feminism, there is a hint of truth to this. In fact, the free market is a real thing, and it applies to value exchanges, and sex is a value exchange. But that's not really the whole statement of it. The free market is a massively simplistic model, and even in financial markets, we see that there are a lot of externalities, a lot of inequalities that develop. The sort of Adam Smith perspective where everyone freely consents to everything and that makes it fine works all right, but it has this assumption that everybody comes to the table being a more or less equal individual with no prior wealth or capital accumulated. Moreover, it presupposes the existence of a society that's built collectively and which not all members share in equally. This creates a funny situation where people who work towards the betterment of society can actually be disadvantaged in the long term by a free market exchange that's entirely selfish. This is why even in completely free market societies, the government will take some aspects of the community and place it outside of the market for the good of the market itself. A key example of this is law enforcement. So where am I going with this, and what does it have to do with sex? Well, to be perfectly blunt about it, in a free market, regardless of how good it is on average, people get fucked.
I only tell you one time. Don't fuck me, Tony. Don't you ever try to fuck me.
And while getting fucked and taken advantage of is painful enough in an economic sense, it's even worse in a personal, sexual, and relationship sense. People don't all come to the table, especially in the sexual matter, as equal individuals all looking for more or less the same thing and willing to pay more or less the same thing. It's a competition where people are massively unequal, have massively different amounts of resources, and subsequently things are unfair. People lose the ability that they would have had otherwise to negotiate for themselves. And things that would have seemed like fair exchanges up front turn out to have major consequences down the road that no party are really willing to stand behind. This is the reason why most modern societies, and indeed most traditional societies that had advanced agriculture, really did not have sex as a marketplace value. This is also the reason why prostitution, or legalized prostitution, as good as it looks on paper, and as good as it looks in the libertarian anarchist's mind, never seems to have good consequences when legalized in actual societies. Men and women have different market values, which peak and dip at different points in their lives. Moreover, both genders have very, very destructive instincts. Women have a hypergamous instinct and men have a polygamous instinct, both of which work to the detriment of developing long-term lasting relationships. When the free market unconstrained is introduced into a system like this, it will only result in disaster. And I know this seems altogether too abstract, so I put together an example. Let's take a look at two individuals, Jack and Jill, and just see how they might function in a Dan Savage-ized, corporatized sexual world where only consent matters and only quality matters. Let's take a look at the life of, say, Jack. Now, like most young men, starting at the age of 13, Jack has a vague notion that he will want to settle down with a wife and a family eventually, but for the time being he wants to sleep with as many women as possible. Now, unless Jack is exceptionally accomplished or attractive for his age, he's likely to have a great deal of problems achieving this end. In fact, if he is in the lower 40% of the distribution of attractiveness, he's likely not even to have a relationship until much later in his development. So the early part of a man's life will be characterized by sexual frustration, a frustration that will not be reflected on the female side, and which will not be understood by a sexual culture that's really geared towards more of an open experience. However, around his late 20s, Jack is likely to have a big turn in his appeal to women. He'll get more developed in his career, and he'll get more mature and confident, and thus a large amount of opportunities will open up to him. In this case, he'll be tempted to essentially exploit this and live out the frustration he had earlier in his life by dating and sleeping with as many women as possible. In the event that he does decide to get married, he might find the arrangement to be more of an economic detriment than a help, because of the easy divorce laws, and the fact that there will be an incentive for women to divorce. He's very likely to end up on the wrong end of a divorce settlement, which will financially cripple him and separate him from any children he has in wedlock. In the meanwhile, any children he has had out of wedlock he will never know either, so we end up with a fundamentally atomized man who has no connection with any children he's fathered in either of the events I've described. But before we feel too sorry for Jack, let's look at what the post-sexual revolution culture has in store for Jill. In contrast to Jack, at a young age, Jill will have a more definite desire to settle down and have a family, and have an immediate desire for a relationship and strong emotional validation. Now, given the current contemporary sexual culture, she'll be encouraged into early sexual exploration. This will include relationships with a lot of men who have no interest in developing the kind of emotional relationship and validation that Jill wants. As a consequence, she will feel very alienated from her sexual experiences and will look for an outlet to explain that. If she persists in this culture, she will likely find this explanation either in the perspective of Sex and the City, that this is all a giant game, or in the perspective of third-wave feminism, which blames the experience on the patriarchy. As a consequence, Jill is likely to spend her younger years in much more transient relationships, and when she finally gets around to settling down in her 30s, she will find the dating market much more difficult to procure long-term relationships with men who actually have the financial ability to support a family. As a consequence, Jill will enter her 30s with very little marriage prospects, wondering where all the good men went. She'll have a very low probability of finding someone to have a family with, and in the event that she does, she'll feel like she's settling, marrying down, and will be more or less unsatisfied with her lot. The probability of her having very many children will be low, and she will feel like her earlier ambitions for that ideal nuclear family have been subverted, and indeed they have been. Now, right here, I have told two stories that are really the product of the sort of sexual marketplace that Dan Savage and the other defenders of the sexual revolution have brought forth. And as bleak as any of these examples sound, really they are commonplace in any forum online, be they MGTOW or feminist forums, where people complain about the problems they've had with the dating world. You hear this all the time. And in both cases, you get the impression that both Jack and Jill have been fucked over. Their ambitions have been destroyed. They've not obtained what seemed to have been a very real possibility that they wanted from the outset. And of course, the immediate temptation on online forums from both the MGTOW and the feminists is to blame the opposite sex. Certainly, if Jill was fucked, it was Jack who fucked her, and if Jack was fucked, it was Jill who fucked her. But this is not the case. What we've seen play out is merely what we should expect from market transactions going on in each individual circumstances, where one party had the upper hand. The fact that both parties couldn't come together to cooperate was a byproduct of that market process. And if there's anyone who fucked them, it was sexual educators like Dan Savage.